so I'm going to re-record a video that I did last week. One of my viewers told me that basically it was way too windy and it sounded like I was in the middle of Chicago's nastiest windstorm. So he asked me if I could do a part 2 or re-record this video. So I'm going to actually go over this video again and add a little bit more to it. So I'm going to tell you guys why, as a web developer, you should focus on React Native and not try to build a mobile application natively. So let's get into it. So first off, if you're a web developer, that means that you're very familiar with JavaScript. And being familiar with JavaScript basically means that you have a good understanding of JavaScript's built-in functions. You already know how to debug an application using JavaScript, and you understand the best practices around using JavaScript. You may or may not already be aware of this, but React Native is built on JavaScript. It uses everything you're already familiar with when it comes to using JavaScript. And if you actually run into any kind of issues, you already know how to debug your code. When you're debugging your code using React Native, you're still going to use the web browser. You're going to use the inspector. I can't think of the name off the top of my head, but you're going to use the inspector. You can actually console log all the values. You can also check on any kind of API requests or anything of that nature using the web browser. If you're going to build an application natively, you're going to have to get familiar with that language and all its built-in functions. And that takes time, because you're going to have an idea. You can Google some of the best practices or some of the functions that you should use, but when you're actually building an application, you're working with a corporation, a company, there's just things that those blog posts that you're reading, things that those books that you're reading, they're just not going to cover within their documentation. So why is familiarity important? That's because you want to get hired as fast as possible. If you're already a web developer, you know the ins and outs of JavaScript. So when you actually have the job interview, it's going to be a lot easier for you to get hired. They're going to ask you some of the best practices around JavaScript. They're going to ask you if you're familiar with ES6. They're also going to ask you some of the functions that come with ES6. So being a JavaScript developer, you already have a good idea of what to expect during a job interview. Also, having that JavaScript background, when you're actually building an application in React Native, it's going to be a lot easier for you to get started. React Native has built-in components, and those components are similar to what you would see on the web when it comes to like using a div or using like a paragraph. The structure is exactly the same way. It's just different component names and different props. You being a web developer, it won't take you too much time to understand what props those are, and then also the different types of components that you may need to install to actually build a React Native application. Likewise, if you're already trying to build an application natively, then you're going to have to learn how that IDE works and how that language works. So when they're testing you, they're going to ask you what are the best practices around Java, what are the best practices around Objective-C or Swift. They're going to ask you, hey, what if you're in a situation where you have an application that was built on Objective-C and now you're navigating to Swift? Because when you're deploying an application to the Apple Store, Apple always updates Xcode. And with that, the language may or may not update. So if that language does update, that means that some of those components may be deprecated. They're going to expect you to know how to debug that application and to actually get that new build of that application into the Apple Store. If you are an iOS developer, you're going to have to know how to do this. They're going to expect you to know how to do this because you're familiar with the language and you're familiar with the IDE. So that's a whole nother ball game when you're actually trying to learn how to build a mobile application natively. You also have to know how to do the same thing in Android. Android, you're going to use Android Studio. You're going to have to be familiar with Java. You're going to have a good understanding of OOP, which you don't need for React Native. Some React Native applications are built on TypeScript, but for the most part, most applications are built with JavaScript. And the reason behind that, even though things are slowly moving towards TypeScript, the reason behind that is that a lot of the dependencies that React Native uses, those dependencies have yet to move to TypeScript. So because that, you may or may not be limited when building your React Native application. Hey, now you may hear some noise in the background. Ignore it. It's a football game is going on right now. Utah is playing against Washington State. I'm not even sure if they're winning. I stopped watching ball. But anyways, just to sum things up, if you are a web developer and you're interested in mobile development, you don't want to build an application natively. You want to build an application with React Native. Now the reason behind that is because you're already familiar with JavaScript. You don't need to learn an IDE, which all these applications, if you're building it natively, you're going to have to get familiar with Xcode, and you're going to have to get familiar with Android Studio. Now, if you're a React Native developer, you're going to have to touch Xcode and Android Studio because you need it to deploy the application. But you're not going to be doing too much work within those IDEs. So when you have a job interview, they're not going to expect you to know everything about that IDE. So that's the language and the IDE, and then debugging. You already, if you're a web developer, you know JavaScript, you know how to debug using the web browser, and then there's no IDE. Now, if you're building something natively, they're going to expect you to know the language, they're going to expect you to know the IDE, and they're going to expect you to know how to debug. And that's just going to make your life a lot more difficult. Now, if you're interested in building things natively, which I am, because I think learning, you should always be trying to learn, expand, and grow. I would say still, as a web developer, go into React Native, get a feel for how things work on the React Native side, and then once you have a good understanding of React Native, then I would slowly get into iOS development and into Android Studio development. I believe I don't know if it's called Android development, but you can slowly move into that. I will say this though. I was speaking to one of my coworkers, and my coworker was telling me that basically React Native is moving towards building an application. When you build that application in React Native, it's not going to depend on Xcode or Android Studio in the future. And that's because now they're moving towards TypeScript. TypeScript is an OOP language. So in the future, I don't know when that's going to be, but you may not even need to know how to build an application in Xcode or Android Studio. But we'll see how that goes. Anyways, like, comment, subscribe. I'll catch you next time.